I'm going to talk to you first of all about international climate policy, and then about land use change emissions. And that's kind of where I work. I work a lot on land use change emissions, bringing together really trying to synthesize what's been published, comparing different results and trying to work out why they're all different. And I also spend a lot of my time working on a policy interface. Have done for a long time, ever since I was involved in the IPCC third assessment report. And when you produce those assessment reports, at the end of them, when you've gone through all the years of review and all that whole process, which I actually found quite interesting, makes you really careful about how you write, because you're reviewed by a scientific audience, and then you're reviewed by policy makers and NGOs. And the way they question, I mean, I don't just mean question in terms of, climate change is all rubbish, sceptical, but I mean question in terms of the way they interpret what you're writing. Makes you really realise how different audiences view what you're writing, how different words mean different things to different, and they're translated into different languages, and how the work you do can be taken and used in different ways, and it's a really fascinating process. And then right at the end of all that, when we've got our final draft and it's all summarised into the summary for policymakers, that goes off to plenary, and that the summary for policymakers is agreed line by line with a room full of representatives from every government. So you have to maintain that the scientists are there, as well as a small selection of the hundreds of authors are there to make sure that the science remains valid. But all that wording has to be agreed by policymakers, and I found that a really fascinating process. And you do kind of get the country bias in that, where you've got certain countries like Saudi Arabia and the fossil fuel producing countries are trying to water down messages, and other countries like Germany are trying to play up the strength of science messages, and our job is to be there and just make sure the science is correct and maintain that as well as we can, while trying to find some compromise text that everyone's happy with. And sometimes those compromises are good ones, and sometimes they're a little bit frustrating. So, for example, in this round of the IPCC, there were pictures that were taken out that showed emissions by country groupings, because that was considered to be controversial. So even though it was scientific fact, different countries didn't want the regional groupings of emissions shown in the summary for policymakers. Those figures are still there in the underlying documents. So there's all these kind of odd things happening. Anyway, I thought it was really interesting, and so I kind of switched a bit on working for the science to policy interface, but still try and do science as well. So I'm going to talk about international climate policy. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background first on some principles of environmental law that are very relevant to the policy debate, to the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And tell you about the Kyoto Protocol, which is a kind of legally binding bit of the UNFCCC that applies to developed countries. I'm going to talk about what happens beyond the Kyoto Protocol, because that only takes us out to 2020. And then I'm going to talk very specifically about land use mitigation within the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. And I'm going to show you a little bit of stuff about what the emissions gap is. So the first bit of fundamental environmental law is the Precautionary Principle. So the Precautionary Principle basically takes account of the fact that if there's something possibly going on that's going to be dangerous, irreversible, catastrophic, then that, and even if the science about that isn't certain, that should be taken account of in decision making. So the idea of something could happen, it could be really bad. The science isn't completely in yet, but there's enough to know that there might be an effect, and this could be potentially very serious. Then the adverse effects of that, something should be done to prevent them. And this principle was taken into account in the UNFCCC Article 3. So there was a big international meeting in Rio in 1992, and they came up with a Rio Declaration, which was 27 principles that all countries agreed to follow, and one of the principles was on the Precautionary Principle. And then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was written, and the Precautionary Principle was written into that. So parties should take precautionary measures to anticipate, prevent, or minimise the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. When there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing such measures. So that's pretty fundamental, and you know, a lot of countries have signed up to this. Another very fundamental environmental law principle is the idea of the tragedy of the commons. And this is all about we share resources. We might share resources internationally, like the air, or people might share resources locally, like having a common that everybody grazes their sheep on. But the idea is you have a shared resource, and if people act independently and selfishly, they can ruin that resource for everyone else. So there's a need for people to act in the group's long-term interests rather than their own personal self-interest, in order that they don't deplete the common resource. And so the idea is then that people need to act together, and this requires international treaties over some environmental issues that are international in scope. So in a sense, countries are saying, we'll stop doing things that are putting costs, or having impacts on you, if you stop doing things that are having impacts on us, and there's some kind of agreement. And it essentially commits all the actors, all the people involved, all the groups involved, into acting together to have behaviour that's optimal for all of them. That's a really fine principle. But the thing is, there's winners and losers in climate, so not all the costs are experienced equally. So there are people who pollute more, and the costs are experienced by different people more than the other way around. And so you've got different levels of impacts and different levels of responsibility for the causes, and that's what makes it quite a difficult problem. So this is a nice infographic that hopefully we'll get permission to keep using when it goes out on the public video for the talk. So this was produced by the US Energy Information Administration, and the size of the circles indicates the emissions from each country in the year 2009. It's an interesting year to pick, and because you can't quite see what they've written up here, I've written it out here. So the latest data published by the US Energy Information Administration provides a unique picture of economic growth and decline. China has sped ahead of the US, as shown by this map. So here's a message that the US Energy Administration is trying to give out. It's not us anymore, we're not the bad guys anymore, it's China. Have a look at what they're doing. Don't keep going on at us. And for the first time, world emissions have gone down. So this was in 2009, when there was the world recession, and emissions have since gone up. So that key message isn't there anymore, but it's still quite interesting, this key message of, you know, go and have a look at China. It's not us. Of course, that's looking at total emissions. Things become a bit different when we take the population into account and look at emissions per capita. So on this side, you've still got the total emissions, and again, the size, this is done in the shape of a footprint to have that kind of carbon footprint tie-in. It's quite a nice way of showing it. Size of the circles on this side, again, relate to total carbon emissions. This is the same data, more or less, from the US National Energy Administration, but it's for 2007 rather than 2009. So you've got China here, nice big circle, United States here, nice big circle. No, there's nothing here saying that the USA is the biggest polluter ahead of China. But then what happens is when we look at it, emissions per capita, so divided by the population, and China goes from this nice big circle here to really quite a small circle here. The United States goes to a much smaller circle as well in terms of per capita emissions. Interestingly, here's Gibraltar, hardly any total emissions, really small. You can't even see that little dot there barely. Oops, my mouse is gone, so you can't see it at all now. Gibraltar turns into that big hill there. Any ideas why? Any ideas what might be so special about Gibraltar that their emissions per capita are so high? Absolutely right, yeah, that's absolutely right. Here's Germany, which goes to this dot here, and the UK, I did look up the UK, where is it? UK's gone from there to somewhere down here. Does that say UK? I can't quite tell. So anyway, quite a different picture when you look at it by emissions by capita. But this is still only part of the story. So this is still about emissions in 2007 or 2009. And there's a big historical component to emissions. So this figure's from Dave Mackey's book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. It's really about how we address the energy needs, and it's freely, you can download the whole book actually for free. But this takes account of a historical perspective and looks at emissions over 1880 to 2004. So over that whole historical period, this is showing you the average pollution rate in tons of CO2 per person, so the per capita emissions averaged over that whole period are along here, and then the population is along there. So if you times the per capita emissions by the population, the area of that graph gives you total emissions over the historical period. And so this gives you a better sense of where things stand. So the USA over that whole period, very high per capita emissions, and a smaller population than China with a massive population, but lower per capita emissions over that period. And it gives you a better sense of historical contribution. Here we go, we've got Germany and UK there, just as little examples as well. So this brings us to the third law principle I'm going to tell you about, which is the polluter pays. The idea being that the party responsible for producing pollution is, after all, the person who should pay for the damage done. This brings about many very controversial issues that are part of what makes it hard to get agreement. How much you count historic emissions? If we didn't really know about climate change, before about 1990, should we be held responsible for those emissions that we were doing when we didn't know they were bad? Who should be responsible? Who are the people who need to act? Is it us as individuals? Is it the fossil fuel companies? Should it be the governments? And if the people who are producing the pollution are different from the people experiencing the impacts, then that leads to injustice. And is that a persuasive argument? Should we do it because we feel the impacts, we want to do it ourselves, or should we do it because we feel morally that it's unfair that we carry on behaving like we want to behave and people in Bangladesh get flooded? So the principle comes down to having common but differentiated responsibilities, and it's all about how you do that. So you've got to recognise that there are historical differences as well as current differences in the amount of contribution to the pollution problem, but also that people have different ability to do something about it because they have different economic status or they have different technological capacity to act. So again, if we look at how this is played out in the UNFCCC text, it recognises that developed countries are principally responsible for the current high levels of greenhouse gas emissions, and it takes account of the historical perspective of 150 years of industrial activity. So the Kyoto Protocol, which I'll tell you more about in a minute, places a heavier burden on developed nations under this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So this allows you to deal with some of the issues of equity, and it allows you to have burden sharing. So share that burden of doing something about it out amongst people. But the question is how? How does that burden get shared? So let you take that in a minute. This is a graph that serves the principle of contraction and convergence, which has been talked a lot in the negotiations. There's particular figures from the Global Commons Institute and a guy called Aubrey Mayer who's pushed a lot about contraction and convergence. And it talks about what we would need to do. In this case, this figure is what we'd need to do to limit concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere or carbon equivalent. I don't know if this one's just CO2 or carbon equivalent, to 450 parts per million. So this is what emissions have been historically. Here they are going up from 1800, getting to about year 2000. And this is what would need to happen to emissions in order to limit the concentration to 450 parts per million. And then the question is how you share out that budget of emissions. And here we have the emissions by different countries in terms of their tons of carbon per capita. The idea is we should get it to such that all countries have emissions that are equal in terms of tons of carbon per capita. So USA emissions would have to decrease. Indian emissions could go up slightly, and the Soviet Union, OECD have to come down, China goes up slightly, and the rest of the world goes up slightly. And then from that point on, all countries have the same budget in terms of emissions per capita. And the total budget's going down like that. And so these are what different countries can emit if you stick to this particular model of contraction and convergence. So how do we do that? That's quite hard to achieve. There's different types of way of achieving it. So you can have the kind of top-down command and control where you have very strong laws and you have bans and you have targets. You can't do this, you have to limit this. Or you can have market-based solutions, such as which is meant to help you try and find the cheapest solutions. So things like carbon tax and emission trading permits. And I'll talk a bit more about those later. So just a little quick review to get you thinking a little bit on your feet. I wonder if some people could tell me the problems you think there have been or think there might have been in order to get global agreement, because it's been hard. We've got some global agreements, we're not quite there yet. What do you think the problems are? I wonder if I put your hand up. You can say things I've said back to me, or you can come up with your own things. Any comments and thoughts on why it's been really difficult? Yeah, very good. So there's countries where actually they see it as a bit of a benefit right now. You know, all that CO2 fertilization, our crop productivity is going up. It's going to be a bit warmer. How nice. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, and that's a really, really massive argument used about not doing anything about climate change. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And some of them, I think there's already quite a lot of... Anyone here from New Zealand? There's already quite a lot of immigration into New Zealand, isn't there, from some of the small island states? Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. And people are starting to produce those maps now of not just production emissions, but import-export emissions and consumption emissions. So, yeah, difference in values and beliefs, or the seriousness of the problems. Within countries, government can impose rules. At the international level, there is no world government. The United Nations is not a world government. They're quite ineffective at being a world government. They can only encourage other governments to come together. Countries refuse to sign if it's too demanding for them, if they feel it might impact their economy. The costs of doing something about it compared to the cost of not doing something about it, which is all quite individual to your country, especially if the impacts aren't high and you're not feeling the impacts. The influence of your own domestic industry, of your fossil fuel industry, or in the case of Brazil, your forest, agriculture industry, it really puts lobbying pressure on, and you might change your policies or not change your policies. And there are wider policies here. There are issues around power, and perceptions of power have been very important in the negotiations, where smaller countries are now grouping together to feel they can give themselves more power and more of a voice. And that sense that this is just, developed countries again telling developing countries what they have to do. And issues of trade and competitions, that all kinds of complex political and socio-economic issues that make it very hard to get an international agreement. However, it's not entirely impossible. So there has been one very successful international agreement, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer is signed up to now by, I think just about every country. I can't remember the number, 197 countries, including each individual member of the EU. Kofi Annan said it's been the most successful international treaty. The Montreal Protocol came into effect in 1987, but 2 years prior to that they already had a framework convention in place where it kind of set loose commitments and enabled something to start happening, and so developed countries started to do something. You've got this effect that the developed and the developing countries have differentiated responsibilities. So the developed countries have legally binding targets that limit production of ozone-depleting substances. Developing countries have 10 years grace before they have to do anything, and also they're supported with finance from developed countries and technology transfer in order to enable them to do something. So you've got these differentiated responsibilities. There's other things that make it a bit easier than climate change problem. The science is less complex. It's more easy to give the clear evidence for both detecting the change and attributing it to human activity. There's nothing else that's depleting the ozone other than the chemicals we're putting in the atmosphere. It's clear who the polluters are because we've got all the industrial history. Quite importantly, is it was easy to do something about. So, all we had to do was really, when we changed our fridge, just the new fridges available were non-CFC, and instead of using underarm deodorant that had CFCs in, they changed them on the shelves for underarm deodorant that didn't have CFCs in. So we as individuals didn't really have to make any difficult choices. And it was relatively low cost to do with major environmental benefits. So quite a tractable problem compared to what's going on with climate change. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change came into being as part of the Earth Summit in 1992. A little bit before that, when there was concern about the science, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose job it is to bring together scientific information, really, and support the UNFCCC process with science evidence. And the objective of the UNFCCC was to achieve stabilisation of greenhouse gases at a level preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now that's come to be regarded as 2 degrees. There's not really a very clear evidence base as to why 2 degrees was decided upon, but it kind of got fixed upon and has remained. Whether 2 degrees is achievable or not is a matter of scientific study and opinion by lots of people, and there are scenarios out there that achieve it, but it only with really quite dramatic changes in our economy, technology and behaviour. So this system of differentiated commitments of developed and developing countries that was referred to. So Annex 1 countries under the UNFCCC basically means developed countries. And Annex 1 countries are required to, to adopt national policies to mitigate climate change with the aim of returning to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. The differentiated responsibilities for developing countries are more procedural and less strong. They have to establish inventories of emissions by sources and removals by sinks, which the Annex 1 countries also have to do. And they're meant to develop and implement programs containing measures to mitigate climate change, but the compliance cost should be borne by the Annex 1 countries. So there's new and additional financial resources to enable them to do this. So this is within the UNFCCC. These are kind of principles. They're not legally binding in any way, but they're what countries or parties that sign up to the UNFCCC are supposed to do. The Kyoto Protocol is a specific piece of legislation within UNFCCC, and it's a legally binding piece, document. So signatories to the Kyoto Protocol are supposedly legally bound to do something with specific emissions targets. And so all the countries report under UNFCCC, report their greenhouse gas emissions, but Kyoto Protocol countries actually also account for them towards meeting specific targets that are meant to be legally binding. In Annex 1 countries, the aim is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 5% below 1990 levels during the first commitment period in 2008 to 2012. So countries measure their greenhouse gas emissions, sources and sinks, over that period, 2008 to 2012, compare them to their baseline emissions in 1990, and they're meant to be 5% below. That's the essential idea. When it comes to land use change emissions, there was a little bit of negotiating around the 1990 levels, but in specific countries, but generally that's the rules. The 5% emissions reduction target is based around a country's fossil fuel and industrial emissions. So not taking account of LULUCF emissions. So they look at what their fossil fuel and industrial emissions are. Their 5% reduction target is based on that amount. However, they can look at their LULUCF, land use change and forestry emissions, and count the emissions or sinks in that sector towards meeting their target. If you've got emissions in that sector, you're not really going to count it, but if you've got sinks in that sector, then you might count it towards meeting emissions. So 192 parties or countries have signed up, have ratified the Kyoto Protocol. The USA has signed it, but not ratified it. So it means they've kind of signed up to the general principle of it, but they've not ratified it, so for them it's not legally binding. Their target was a reduction of 7%. So the 5% reduction is on average, and that's, again, differentiated responsibility between different countries. Canada had ratified, but then pulled out in 2012. Their target was a reduction of 6%. The EU, as a whole, have a reduction target of 8%, but within the EU, that's spread out between different countries, so different countries have different targets. Japan's is -6. I haven't put all in there, I just put some for illustration. In addition to you having to report and account for your greenhouse gas emissions, which is supposed to motivate you to reduce those emissions, there's a couple of flexible mechanisms. So the clean development mechanism is a kind of project mechanism. It enables developed Annex 1 countries to pay for projects in developing countries, and then the Annex 1 countries can then claim the credits for that. So you could theoretically pay for afforestation in Guatemala and claim the carbon credits. Actually, very few of the clean development mechanism projects are to do with the land use sector, about 1%. So a lot of them are about energy technology, solar panels, energy efficiency improvements. Joint implementation is a similar principle, but it's Annex 1 countries paying for projects in other Annex 1 countries. With a clean development mechanism, the issue will be when we try and bring all countries into an agreement post-Kyoto is then who claims the credits. So if you're paying for emissions reductions project in Guatemala, who can actually claim the credits? Is it you who's paying for it, or is it Guatemala? This is another kind of flexible mechanism, a way that allows you to do things cheaply and more flexibly and look for the cheapest solutions is around emissions trading, and this can happen between Annex 1 parties. So the idea being you've got your target for emissions reduction, and this can be divided into assigned amount units, so basically divvying up the emissions into different units. Now, some countries may have emissions credits, so their emissions reduction is actually greater than the emissions reduction that they had to do under their target. So their target might have been a 6% reduction in emissions. They might actually be achieving an 8% reduction in emissions, and that leaves them with some credits, and they can sell that credit to another country who isn't achieving its targets. And the idea is it becomes flexible, so you can do what becomes most economical in different places. The issue with that is that it doesn't promote countries to do something about it. If they've got the money to just buy emissions credits, they can fail to meet their target and buy emissions credits. It particularly becomes an issue because of something that's become known as hot air. Anyone heard of hot air in this context? It's quite nice. So the idea is, so for example, in the UK we had a big dash for gas. So we changed from burning coal to burning gas, as a result of which we're looking pretty good towards meeting our emissions targets. We're well below target. We're getting a bit closer because we've done the dash to gas now and we feel the effects for that, so we're kind of needing to look for new things, but for the moment we're in carbon credit, so we can happily go and sell off our emissions. However, we're not in carbon credits because the dash for gas was anything to do with climate change. It was because it was cheaper and Thatcher didn't like the coal industry and whatever political other issues you want to talk about. So in a sense, we're still not, it made us be lazy. We don't have to do anything about climate change emissions because we're in a good position, and we can sell our credits. Similar thing with Russia, with a drop in, with a economic collapse, and then becoming credit, and also moving to gas. So there's all these different reasons why countries might be in credit. But it's nothing to do with climate change, it's just hot air. It's going to happen anyway. It's hot air and you can sell your hot air credits on, so it's not really doing anything to help reduce climate change. So those are some of the issues. I'm going to cover a couple more in a minute, but I just go through the status of the negotiations, because the Kyoto Protocol came back in 1997. We had a first commitment period. The second commitment period's been agreed, was been 2013 to 2020, but that commitment period is over, and then what happens beyond Kyoto? And ever since the Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1997, there's been this ongoing process to start moving beyond that. It's all a very long process. So the COPs are conferences of the parties. Every year, all the parties that are signed up to the UNFCCC meet and negotiate. They have one big conference once a year, usually happens in December. You'll have heard of some of these, like Copenhagen, Barley was quite a famous one, Cancun. The most recent one is Lima, and the next one's in Paris next year. They do meet more often than this, but these are just the really big meetings when all the governments show up. They also have smaller meetings in between to resolve technical issues. So COP3 in 1997 was in Kyoto, hence the Kyoto Protocol. All of these, they like to kind of come up with a new name. So you've got your Copenhagen Accord, and that was in 2009. And the interesting thing for me about that was that RED, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, became included and started to be talked about. It actually happened a bit earlier in Barley, but it was when it was started to be in the framework. And different countries started to make pledges, and I'll come back to the country pledges in a bit. In Durban in 2011, there was quite a move forward in terms of agreeing to develop a new treaty that will be adopted in Paris next year. And so then there's been this build-up to trying to get the text of that new treaty in place and negotiate what that's actually going to look like. At COP18 in Doha, countries agreed to have a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, and some countries signed up to it, but some countries didn't. COP19 was a little bit of a washout, and COP20 in Lima carried on with this idea of countries having pledges, which are now termed INDCs, or intended nationally determined contributions. So each country is meant to come up essentially with a pledge of what they're going to do, and they're meant to present those. The deadline was originally March, but it's slipped back a bit. But I think Sweden actually pledged, so they're the first country that's put in their INDC formally and put it in yesterday or this week. There was other things that happen at COP. So mitigation is quite a fundamental principle of UNFCCC. There was a very strong move in Lima to try and move away from mitigation to just consider an adaptation. So according to one of our colleagues who's a negotiator, one of the main successes of Lima was actually to get mitigation to stay on the table as being essential to the UNFCCC. So just to show you a little bit about the pledges. This figure's from IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation. And it's this left-hand bars here are basically showing you what policies are in place towards mitigation, and the darker colour here is there's actually climate legislation in countries, and the bluer colour here is there's a strategy and a coordinating body, but it's nothing legally binding. So about 45% of total greenhouse gas emissions were covered by some kind of policy in 2007. In 2012, that's gone up to about 67% of greenhouse gas emissions by some kind of policy, not always legally binding. And this by country gives you an idea of the sort of things in place. Now, the dark blue countries are essentially ones that are signed up to Kyoto. So quantified emissions limitation reduction obligations. So these are countries that have kind of obligations. So something a little bit more legally binding in place. The QERTs, quantified economy-wide emission reductions targets. So these are countries that have targets, not legally binding. And the NAMAs are national mitigation activities, and so they're kind of the pledges, the softer ones, and they're shown pledges by impact or pledges by action, but they're essentially countries that have made some kind of pledge. A little later on I'll talk you through some of the pledges in the land sector. So the issue of hot air I've already covered, and that's kind of covered these are some key issues that keep coming up in the negotiations. The issue of additionality, so it's kind of covered in the hot air one. Are you doing this as something additional? Is this activity, would it have happened anyway? Or is it something that's additionally happened because you have actual mitigation policy? Leakage and permanence both become quite important issues in the land sector because everything's connected together. The idea of leakage is, for example, I might do a bioenergy project over here. But that bioenergy project over here might be on cropland, and that food still has to be produced somewhere. So that cropland activity might then shift to over here where forest is cut down to grow the crops. So while my nice bioenergy plant here, farm here, might not actually be cutting down forests and therefore having a big carbon impact, it might have displaced the land use that then does. And that's the idea of leakage, and that's quite difficult to trace and track, especially when you don't have all countries and all places included in the agreement. The issue of permanence is one that's very pertinent to forests, but also other kind of projects. So you might set up a solar farm, but for some reason they might have a technological breakthrough, or someone might decide they want to change the land and they get rid of it. It's not permanent. With a forest, you might plant a forest. It might be subject to fire or pest or disease, and that might be more of a problem in the future as climate changes. Finance is the biggest sticking point at all the negotiations. The biggest arguments come over who's going to pay for this and how they're going to pay for this, how much are countries willing to put forward, and in what format should that be, and how does that get shared out. And another issue is there aren't actually any penalties for non-compliance. So the Kyoto Protocol is a legally binding document, but what happens if you miss your target? Nothing really. There's no kind of thing in place to penalise you if you miss your targets. So now I'm going to go a bit more specifically into land-based mitigation policy. Going back to that list of what happened at all the COPs again, I'll pick out a few additional things in here. So the Barley Action Plan was the first time RED was mentioned. Now, RED is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. So it was first referenced and mentioned in 2007. By 2009, there was some actual text and a recommendation of including it, and text being put in place. 2011, so this was the time when we agreed to develop a new treaty by Paris in 2015. But there were also quite a lot of changes to the way the land sector, the LULUCF sector, is accounted under the Kyoto Protocol, that dealt with a lot of issues where, they've been accounting it for a few years and there were problems, and there was a real attempt to move forward and put in place some different guidance to improve that. Warsaw was a bit of a washout generally for the treaty, as I mentioned. People were frustrated that there was very little movement forward in making the Paris Agreement, but there was some constructive set of agreements to bolster RED. And as I mentioned, in 2014, we had the call for these INDCs for countries to make. So, mentioned before, the Kyoto commitments and targets are in reference to fossil fuel emissions, but you can count the LULUCF sector towards meeting those. So let's have a look at how that's done. So the land sector and the Kyoto, greenhouse gas reporting under UNFCCC, so all countries have to report their emissions from different sectors. And the reporting in the land sector is based on stock change. So you look at change in carbon stocks, and that's living and dead, above ground and below ground, soil carbon. During your commitment period, during that reference period of 2008 to 2012, or the second commitment period, 2013 to 2020, compared to what those stocks were in 1990. And the idea is that it should incentivize countries to reduce emissions or create sinks. The land is split up into different categories: forest land, cropland, grassland, wetland, settlement, or other land. And within those categories, you report conversion from one land type to another, and also emissions from within that land type. So, for example, in cropland, you'd count emissions from fertilizer use and methane emissions from rice paddies, things like that. So change between land cover change and also land management are covered, but within specific categories. That's generally under the United Nations Framework Convention, where all countries report. Specifically under Kyoto Protocol, where countries also get to choose whether they want to account for their LULUCF emissions and count it towards their targets, there's some more developed rules. So the reporting under UNFCCC is subject to guidance, which the IPCC has developed, and so is the accounting under the Kyoto Protocol. And so I've been involved in IPCC a lot of times in doing the assessment reports, and that's been fun, and I've liked doing it, and I've learnt loads of science. And if you ever get an opportunity to do it, it's great, and you learn a lot. But it does take up a lot of your time. But I do find it a fascinating process. For the first time this year, or not this year, over the last few years, I got asked to be involved in rewriting the revised supplementary methods and good practice guidance arising from the Kyoto Protocol. So this is how you do the bean counting. And I thought, I'm not really sure I want to do this. I think it'll be a bit dull, but it'd be interesting to learn how it works. Okay, all right, I'll do it. And it's been a really different process, and I've actually found it very fascinating, because suddenly now you're not just kind of generally saying people have to do this and people are arguing whether there's climate change or not climate change. This actually talks about how you account for it, how you actually do the counting up the numbers. And suddenly countries really care. They really care individually, because how you make the rules could make quite a big difference to what their LULUCF emissions or sinks are. And so they get really involved. And when we wrote the document, there was actually very few scientists working on the document. A lot of them were people who worked within governments doing the reporting and accounting. And some of them were even sort of policymakers who weren't doing it, who were just kind of getting involved to make sure that they got their particular point across. Because for some countries, quite a large proportion of their emissions come from the LULUCF sector. Australia's got massive grasslands, New Zealand's got the sheep production. Although these guidance are for Annex 1 countries, there's a lot of interest from developing countries too, because the idea is that probably quite similar methodologies will be adopted by the developing countries. So it becomes very controversial. How it stands under the Kyoto Protocol is countries must, that it's mandatory for them to account to afforestation, reforestation and deforestation, and that's typically compared to the 1990 baseline of whether there's been afforestation, reforestation or deforestation since 1990. Don't worry too much about the difference between afforestation and reforestation. They're essentially the same thing, it just depends when it happened. So I think, I can't remember the exact year, but so afforestation is there'd been no forest for 100 years or something, and reforestation is there was forest more recently and it's been cut down and now you're reforesting. But that has to have happened compared to 1990. So there was no forest in 1990, and there is now. Then you've got A on R, afforestation and reforestation. If there was forest in 1990, and there isn't now, then that's deforestation. If there was forest in 1990 and there is forest now, but in some point in between then it was cut down, it's still deforestation. Even if it's then been replanted, then it's still counted in the deforestation sector. But that's just where it's accounted for. The issue of human-induced becomes quite an interesting one, and in fact Albert sent me an email about this the other day. Oh, that's the forest definition, okay. Forest definition, so different countries have different forest definition. That always ends up being controversial. I'm sure if a lot of you are doing land use change, you've come across this a lot. When you look at different land use data sets, they all have different forest areas, and it's because everyone uses a different forest definition. The same is also true here, and IPCC felt it wasn't for them to impose a forest definition on anyone. So there's a range. So you can define your forest anywhere within the range of a minimum area of 0.05 to 1 hectare, and a minimum tree cover of 10 to 30%, and a minimum tree height at maturity of 2 to 5 meters. The country defines a forest, and then they have to stick to that definition, but they all might have a slightly different definition of forest. And it has to have met that definition in 1990 or not, so you can define what it is. Forest management definition is also done by country and is very variable. So some countries just more or less say all of our forest is virtually managed because there's no real unmanaged land. So countries like Finland, Denmark say 100% of our forests are managed. They all count as managed forests. Other countries like Poland don't define management very narrowly, as we're actually really doing something specific, or it's actual plantations, and so they only define 5% of their forests as managed. I don't know. This was a few years back, and we were talking about this at breakfast. I don't know if you think that that's different if they're talking about actual plantations, but that's what they're defining as. Sebastian knows a lot about forest management history. So Poland say of our forests only 5% are managed. There's some boring definition issues that make a big difference. Human-induced. So this is saying if you deforest or if you afforest, you have to have deliberately done that in order to account here. So this becomes an interesting issue where you've got EU set aside. So we've set aside a lot of our land in EU because we're overproducing. Can we count that as direct human-induced afforestation where the purpose of it was for mitigation or was for having increased carbon on that land? So the wording that came out was the relevant information is necessary to provide information demonstrating that activities are direct human-induced, and that could be documentation demonstrating decisions been taken aimed at planting or promoting or allowing forest regeneration. And this became very controversial. There's lots of reasons. We were talking about land abandonment in Russia and Eastern Europe for various political reasons, or in places it happens because of war, or it's just not economic to manage land. Can you count that as AR? Of course, countries want to. Even if it wasn't for that, they want to be able to count those things. If you've got a forest regrowth as due to environmental change, like the expansion of the forest line with warming north or high up mountains, then you can't count that as human-induced AR. Similarly with deforestation, has to be human-induced, so if it's because of an environmental change and drought and you've lost your forest for that way, you shouldn't be penalised for that as deforestation. If there's natural disturbance, fire, then that's not really deforestation, providing you let the forest grow. However, if there happens to be a fire go through and you go, oh, that was handy, now I'm going to plant my crops there, and you've changed land use, then that is deforestation. So there's all these really different rules that countries have to abide by. Afforestation, reforestation, deforestation, as this is mandatory. Forest management wasn't mandatory to account for in the first commitment period. It's become mandatory. And they've gone for account for it by reference level, which I'll come back to in a moment. In fact, I think with the next slide. So the idea of the reference level is a lot of countries have planted forests prior to 1990, especially in Europe and America. There's been lots of forest planting that has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of aim to mitigate climate. It just happened. And if you are just counting the stock increase in your managed forests, since 1990 to today, you'd have growth in these forests that were planted way before 1990. And so that means you end up with some potential winners who can claim, could be able to claim that credit because they've got carbon growth in their forests, and some losers where they're losing carbon from historical deforestation, or because where things are in the plantation harvest cycle. So you've got potential winners and losers, and you've got stuff going on in managed forests that's nothing to do with mitigation. You've also got the environmental impacts of, for example, slightly warmer climates and CO2 fertilisation. You shouldn't be able to claim those. So the idea is you should have a reference level. You should say, this is what my forest was, this is how it was managed in 1990, this is what was going on. This is what I would expect to happen to it if I didn't change management practice. I'd expect it to continue growing like this. I might change management then deliberately since 1990. My growth might be like this, so I might increase the stocking density or change the species. Then the idea of a reference level is you can claim that difference between what it would have done without change in management since 1990 and what it does, and now that's what you can claim, and it's still capped. And then finally, there are other sectors like croplands, wetlands, harvested wood products, which countries can choose. It's voluntary whether they choose to include them or not. So these are the sort of decision trees that decision makers go through, and I won't go through it in detail. It's just to give you an idea of, you kind of have to go, was the land covered by trees in the reporting year? So in my commitment period, are there trees? No. Were there trees in 1990? Yes. So there were trees in 1990, they aren't there. It's deforestation. Well, there weren't trees in 1990, and then there's a whole other load of decisions. Or, for example, is it covered by trees in the reporting year? Yes, it is. It's covered by trees in the reporting year. But was there D between 1990 and the reporting year? So had the forest been cut down and regrowth, then you're still reporting it under D. And you go through this whole range of different decisions to decide whether it's D or whether deforestation, whether it's afforestation, reforestation, whether it comes under forest management or whether it comes under other lands. And that's the sort of thing that we spend hours and hours arguing over in this document. Also to be aware of, different countries have different methodological capabilities and methods available, so they also apply different methods to do the accounting. Reporting even. So tier 1 methods are very country scale changes. They're very generic. You say, on my country as a whole, forest land's gone down by so many hectares, and I'm going to use regional emissions factors then to convert that into carbon changes, changing carbon stock. Tier 3 is when you've got very spatially explicit information and country-specific parameters. So I know this piece of forest here has been cut down, and I've got a pretty good idea of what its carbon stock is. I've got country-specific parameters of what their carbon stock is, and the soil carbon and the above-ground carbon, or you're using models. And Tier 2 is sort of in between the two. So it becomes quite hard sometimes to compare emissions from different countries. They're using different definitions. They're including different things, and they're applying different methodologies. So what about beyond the Kyoto Protocol? So I've mentioned REDD a few times. REDD, it was initially talked about as REDD, reduced emissions from deforestation. I added an extra D to include deforestation, and then I added a little plus on to talk about the role of conservation and sustainable management, enhancement of carbon stocks. The conceptual model of REDD is similar to the reference level for forest management. So you have your reference level, this is your deforestation rate, and this is what, it's reducing in this case, and that's where you might expect it to go. And you might manage to reduce it even further, and then this would kind of be the, so you've got your reference level, and then this is where you end up, and that would be the credit you can claim. And here's a very specific example for Brazil. So Brazil's actually got a policy in place, the Brazilian Decree 7390, that required an 80% reduction in forests below the kind of average level between 1995 and 2006. And they were going to achieve that by 2020. So here are their historical emissions in REDD. Here's from where the law came in. This is the kind of baseline where emissions were going when the law came in, so this would be their baseline, was emissions in 2005. This is their target here, is the 80% reduction by 2020. And here you can see they're actually achieving slightly better than their target. And so they've actually outrun their target, but this would be the part they'd be doing credit for, would be here to the target or here to the even to the outrun. In fact, their deforestation rates have gone up slightly because they've had a lot of pressure from the agricultural lobbies, and so the laws are now not as strong as they were. And so here's some specific country pledges. So the Brazil pledge is there. They reduced deforestation in the Amazon region by 80%. They've also got a general emissions reduction pledge, reducing emissions in general by 36 to 39% compared to 2020. That range depends on finance. So without finance, they will only commit to, without lots of additional finance, they'll only commit to 36% reduction. With finance, 39%. Similar thing in Indonesia. If you look below, they've got a range of 26 to 41% reduction. And again, that's largely dependent on whether they receive finance. Indonesia is not specific about how they're going to achieve that, but since 80% of their emissions come from the LULUCF sector, you would imagine they would have to do something in that sector. Things happen about it. China, again, they have a general emissions reduction, which is reduce emissions per unit of GDP by 40 to 45% in 2020. And they're very specific about some measures, including afforestation of 40 million hectares and increasing the stock in forests they've already had, increasing the carbon stock of those forests by 1.3 billion meters cubed. Argentina's got a pledge about bioethanol and biodiesel. Australia's got a pledge of reducing emissions in general by 5 to 20%. Again, LULUCF is responsible for 25% of their emissions, so it could be an important sector for them. Oop. So lastly, I'm going to move on to the emissions gap report that looks at these pledges. So there's really asking the question of, are these pledges enough to meet 2 degrees targets? These pledges have been coming out all the time. As I said, they need to produce their pledges, INDCs, very shortly. But there's lots of different groups that look at the pledges that are already out there. And this information is all pulled together in GAP report. So the GAP report starts by saying what emissions are necessary to reach 2 degrees. So what would the emissions reductions have to be to stay within 2 degrees? And it deals with this idea. It's looked at this here from the point of view of the trillion ton. Has anyone heard of the carbon budget and the trillion ton? A few nods, most not. So the idea is that there's an amount of allowable emissions to stay within 2 degrees. And that's quite limited. It's particularly dependent on the long-lived greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, because a third of the carbon dioxide we emit stays in the atmosphere for millennia. But the target also includes other greenhouse gases. And so we have an available carbon budget of 2,900 gigatons that we can emit from the 19th century onwards in order to stay within 2 degrees. From 2012 onwards, because we've already spent quite a lot of that budget, we've got about 1 trillion tons left that we can emit. And so we can put all different kinds of pathways by which we might reduce our emissions. On this figure here, it goes from 2010 to 2100. We get to this point, our budget's all used up. We've got quite high emissions, our budget's all used up, so we've got this budget overshoot. So if we still want to be on target in 2020, we need negative emissions. And that's going to be an important point I'm going to come back to in the next lecture. If we don't overshoot quite so badly, we manage to control emissions a bit more, our budget overshoots less, we've got lower negative emissions. But the idea being that we need to reach carbon neutrality sometime between 2055 and 2070. That's what the GAP report came up with, and that's based on multiple scenarios that are out in the literature from the sort of integrated assessment models Mark was talking about yesterday. So here we go, historical emissions here. And this is where our emissions would have to be in order to stay within 2 degrees. This is where we're going with business as usual. Here are our historic emissions, and this is what we would expect emissions to be following business as usual pathways. Obviously, there's a range of what that might be because lots of different models are used with, as you saw, lots of different assumptions as to what business as usual might be. So that's the kind of business as usual pathways, and this includes fossil fuel and LULUCF emissions. And we talked about all the different country pledges that are already out there, and this is assessing, so different groups assess the pledges that are out there already and so what will they achieve. And so here we have our business as usual emissions that I just showed you across a range of IMs. This is where we expect to go from 2010 out to 2030. This is what emissions would be consistent with a range of pledge cases. A lot of that pledge cases you can see was due to the things like whether developing countries get financed, but all other reasons where you've got a range across different models as well. So emissions business as usual, emissions according to pledges out to 2020, and here we just see that highlighted there. That's again the emissions business as usual, just 2025 and 2030 highlighted. Emissions under the pledges, and this is where we're meant to be at. And this is our emissions gap, so this is where we still have to go. So we've still got a considerable way to go. There are ways to achieve this. This is from the older version of the GAP report that looked at the IPCC fourth assessment mitigation numbers, and there's different ways to achieve it. This was the gap then, still essentially where we're going and where we need to be. In the power sector, industry, transport, buildings, and here we've got forestry and agriculture. And these are numbers from the IPCC about what mitigation potential was. So there are ways of achieving this, but it's quite dramatic. But just to note here that the land use sector does get us quite a long way to meeting it. It's about a third of emissions reduction there. So in conclusion, there's been a lot of progress in understanding the need. There's been massive amount of science, and science has exploded on the need for emissions reduction. And we do have an international progress, and it's been slow and not as successful yet as the Montreal Protocol, but there is a process and it is moving forward. There's been a lot of progress in bringing the land sector into the process, and this has been very hard because of all the complicated rules and the different country positions, but it is in there. However, so far the effects of the climate have been quite minimal, and there's still a lot to do. But the process is there, and we have it. And whether you think it's a good process or not, at least it is a process, it's there, it's got people discussing. There's a lot to do, and there's ways to achieve it. Whether climate policy will achieve it, fingers crossed for Paris. I've put some reading on the end there, but I won't leave that out. That's just on the slides, so when you see the slides, there's some of the references and websites there. That's it.